We're going to be looking at subordinators and how they make complex sentences. So, before we start, we need to be able to differentiate how transitions and subordinators function. They have very different functions, and punctuation. So, first of all, remember that the transition comes between two separate sentences and that a transition does not combine sentences. So, he spoke English well. Sentence 1. Transition word, period. The transition starts the new sentence. Okay, sentence 2. So, you can see with this period that the transition does not combine the sentences. Second, the transition shows the relationship of the second sentence to the first sentence. Here, however, is a transition of contrast. In other words, it shows that the first sentence 1 has a different idea to the second sentence. Okay, let's move on now and let's talk about subordinators now. Something I need to mention before we keep going is a clause. A clause is similar to a sentence, but slightly different. Okay, a clause can be a sentence in that it has a subject and a verb. Okay, but there are some important things I need to mention, so let's talk about that now. If a subordinator is added to a sentence, it is no longer a sentence. Okay, so for example, sentence, independent clause, he spoke English well. Okay, that's a sentence. Okay, the moment we add the subordinator, for example, although, okay, then he spoke English well is no longer a sentence. It is now a dependent clause and needs to be connected to a sentence. That is an independent clause. So here we end a dependent clause with a comma, not a period. Okay, unless it's attached to a independent clause. So keep in mind, when writing a dependent clause without a dependent clause without an independent clause is a fragment. That is an error. So although he spoke English well is a fragment. We'll talk a little bit more about this later and how to correct that. But moving on, dependent clauses, that is a clause with a subordinator, need to have an independent clause, and that is a complex sentence. A dependent clause combined with an independent clause. So, although he spoke English well, dependent clause, he never spoke up in class, independent clause, and all of this is a complex sentence. Okay, we have our subordinator or subordinating conjunctions. Okay, and all of this is a dependent clause because of the subordinator. Remember that the subordinating conjunction comes at the beginning of a dependent clause. And because it has a subordinating conjunction, although he spoke English well, cannot be made into a sentence. It needs to have an independent clause, which we have here. So it's a sentence. Okay, so quick review. The transition comes between two separate sentences and it does not combine the sentences. So he spoke English well, sentence 1, period. However, transition, he never spoke up in class, sentence 2. Okay, on the other hand, a subordinator comes before a dependent clause, which must be attached to an independent clause. Although he spoke English well, subordinator, dependent clause, comma, he never spoke up in class, independent clause. And this is a complex sentence. Okay, so we talked about complex sentences being a dependent plus an independent clause. Okay, so a complex sentence is a dependent clause combined with an independent clause. Although he spoke English well, okay, subordinator, dependent clause, independent clause, he never spoke up in class. That's our sentence. Keep in mind, a fragment is a dependent clause without an independent clause. Although he spoke English well, period. Okay, so keep in mind, when writing a dependent clause, an independent clause without an independent clause, that is a fragment. So how do we correct these? Let's talk about how to fix fragments. So these are two sentences, but there's an error. There's a fragment here. Okay, he never spoke up in class, period, although he spoke English well, period. You can see that although is a transition and it starts a dependent clause, but this dependent clause is not attached to an independent clause, so we have a fragment. So how do we correct this? Well, first you can find the independent clause and connect it to the dependent clause. So we have our dependent clause, our independent clause, we just combine them. We delete the period. So Instead of having a period here, we delete it. So he never spoke up. He never spoke up in class, although he spoke English well. No period. Delete it. You can also change the subordinator to a transition. He never spoke up in class, period. However, comma, he spoke English well. Okay, so there it is. Those are solutions for fixing fragments. Let's talk about the subordinators and the form, the grammar, okay, the punctuation. So, first of all, the dependent clause may come before or after the independent clause. If the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, then it must be followed by a comma. So after, he never spoke up in class, no comma. Okay, independent clause, no comma. Subordinator, dependent clause. Okay, although he spoke English well. Okay, now what if the dependent clause comes first? Okay, although he spoke English well, subordinator, dependent clause, comma, he never spoke up in class, independent clause. Okay, so if the dependent clause comes first, you gotta add that comma. Okay, moving forward now, what about the meaning? Well, subordinators have a lot of meaning, similar to transitions. Subordinators show the relationship between the dependent clause and the independent clause. Some transition words are while, which we use for time. Okay, the dog and the cat fought while they were home yesterday. Okay, we use because to show cause and effect relationship. Because, okay, his cows ate all the grass. The rabbit had nowhere to hide. Okay, it's cause and effect. For we use if for conditions. The cows will be sick if they eat those bushes. Okay, to show the condition. And although, for a contrasting relationship, which we have already seen. Although they did not eat the bushes, the cows ate all the plants. Okay, so there are many different types of transitions. Subordinators. We have subordinators of time, such as after, as soon as, since. For purpose, so that, so. For conditions, if, unless, even if. To add an opposite idea, although, even though. To introduce an example. For example, for instance, and for cause and effect. Because, since, and as. So, quick summary. The two most important things we need to remember. Subordinator comes before dependent clause, which must be attached to an independent clause. Otherwise, it is a fragment. Although he spoke English well, this is a fragment. Okay, subordinator, dependent clause. Okay, we need an independent clause. He never spoke up in class. And keep in mind, it's an error if the independent clause is missing. Good. Similar to transition, subordinators show the relationship between dependent clauses and independent clauses. Because we carpool every day, we save money. Cause, reason, effect. Here, because is subordinator, singular, and cause and effect relationship. I hope that you enjoyed this long presentation. If you have any thoughts, questions, or concerns, please email me, and I look forward to seeing you in class.